The rain had just stopped when I arrived at my son's house, carrying my small suitcase and wearing the coat I made myself years ago. His home looked fancy, all glass and shining lights, the kind of place where everything felt new and perfect. My son's wife opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her gaze moved from my shoes to my dress, and I could tell what she was thinking. To her, I looked old and out of place. She had no idea the clothes she was mocking once turned heads on fashion runways. The air inside smelled like candles and polished wood, nothing like the warm, home-cooked scent I was used to. I stood in the entryway for a moment, my shoes squeaking softly on the marble floor. Daniel came out of the kitchen, surprised but happy to see me. He gave me a quick hug, and I could tell his warmth was genuine. But the way Vanessa looked at me reminded me I didn't quite fit here. I smiled anyway, pretending not to notice how her eyes stayed fixed on my clothes. I handed Daniel the small cake I'd baked that morning. It wasn't fancy, just something I had always made for birthdays and visits. He smiled politely, but Vanessa barely glanced at it before setting it aside on the counter. The silver appliances and spotless counters made it feel more like a showroom than a home. I could tell she liked everything perfect, right down to appearances. I wanted to tell her that perfection often hides loneliness, but I stayed quiet. There was no use in teaching lessons no one asked for. Dinner was already set, and Vanessa insisted I sit at the head of the table. I could tell it wasn't out of respect, but to keep me visible, like a decorative piece. She talked about her job in fashion, her new clients, and how much she loved modern design. I nodded and listened, but inside, I couldn't help noticing the irony. She spoke with such pride about an industry I once helped shape, though she'd never believe that. I took a sip of water and smiled, letting her have her stage. During dinner, Vanessa's friends joined through a video call, laughing about trends and designers I used to know personally. They called my floral dress retro chic with a tone that wasn't meant as a compliment. Daniel laughed along, not catching their sarcasm, and I didn't correct him. I had learned long ago that silence can say more than words ever could. Still, a small part of me hurt, not from their words, but from how quickly people forget that everything new eventually becomes old again. When dinner ended, I offered to help with the dishes, but Vanessa waved me off. "You're our guest," she said, though it sounded more like, "Don't touch anything." I stood by the window for a while, watching the rain begin again. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. I thought about my old workshop, the smell of fabric dye, the hum of sewing machines. I missed the rhythm of those days, where every stitch carried a story. Now I was just an old woman in someone else's spotless home. That night, in the guest room, I unpacked my small suitcase carefully. Each piece of clothing had a memory stitched into it. A scarf I made for a client in Paris, a dress I wore at my first fashion show. I hung them neatly in the small closet, then looked at my coat on the chair, the same coat I had made for an editor decades ago, one that was photographed on magazine covers before the world forgot my name. I smiled faintly. Let them mock it. Time has its own quiet revenge. The next morning, I joined them for breakfast. Vanessa was already dressed in a sleek outfit, her hair perfectly done. She complimented her own shoes as she poured coffee, mentioning how expensive they were. Daniel tried to bring me into the conversation, but Vanessa redirected it back to herself every time. I didn't mind. I was used to people like her, so busy shining, they never realized how easily light fades. I stirred my tea slowly and asked about her work. Her eyes lit up, like I'd handed her a mirror. She talked about trends and designers, about exclusive materials and statement pieces. I nodded and listened, but I recognized many of the techniques she described. They were things I had done by hand, long before computers took over the craft. Vanessa seemed proud of things she barely understood. I wanted to tell her that real fashion isn't about being seen, it's about making people feel something. But I kept that thought to myself. Some lessons are only learned when the world teaches them the hard way. Later that day, Vanessa offered to take me shopping. She said it so sweetly that I almost agreed, but something in her tone felt off. I could hear the hidden suggestion that I needed something more modern. I smiled and declined, saying I preferred clothes that told stories. She laughed, thinking I was being sentimental. Maybe I was. I had spent a lifetime turning cloth into confidence for others. I wasn't about to let someone make me ashamed of what my hands had created. That afternoon, I took a small walk around their neighborhood. Every house looked the same. Tall fences, trimmed lawns, perfect symmetry. No children playing, no laughter, no open doors. It felt quiet in a strange way, like beauty without life. When I came back, Vanessa was on the phone, talking about a gala she'd be attending. She mentioned needing to stand out, though I couldn't imagine how she'd ever blend in with all that pride. I quietly brewed tea, pretending not to hear her say, "I hope she doesn't embarrass us." Daniel asked me if I wanted to come to the gala. Vanessa froze, clearly not expecting that. She smiled tightly and said, "If she wants to." I said I'd rather stay home. Crowds weren't for me anymore. I could see the relief on her face as she nodded quickly. I told Daniel not to worry. Some people feel more comfortable when others stay small. It's not anger, it's fear. And fear, I've learned, often hides behind designer labels and perfect smiles. After dinner, Vanessa showed off the dress she planned to wear to the gala. It was a custom piece, expensive and delicate. I could tell by the stitching that whoever made it rushed the work. I didn't say anything at first, but when she asked my opinion, I mentioned a weak seam near the waist. She brushed it off, saying her designer knew what he was doing. I nodded politely. Some people mistake confidence for skill. I'd let the fabric teach her what words couldn't. That night, I sat by the window in the guest room, the faint sound of a bell ringing somewhere in the distance. It reminded me of my younger days, working long hours in a small factory that once stood near a church. Every night, that same bell marked the end of our shift. I remembered laughing with the other girls, sharing dreams over cold tea. Most of them were gone now, scattered by time, but every sound of that bell still reminded me. I built a life with my own two hands. The next morning, Vanessa was panicking. The seam I warned her about had split as she tried on her gown. I heard her shouting from her room, frustration echoing down the hall. Daniel called for me, asking if I could take a look. When I entered, Vanessa looked embarrassed but desperate. I asked for a needle and thread, and within minutes, I fixed the damage so cleanly it looked brand new. She stared at my hands like they were performing magic. I didn't say a word, I just smiled and told her it was ready. She thanked me quickly, clearly more shocked than grateful. As she left for the gala, she still didn't understand what she had just witnessed. I stood by the window again, watching her car disappear into the rain. I thought about how strange it is that people chase newness while standing on the shoulders of the past. Maybe one day she'd see it. For now, I was content to let her think she'd won. Sometimes quiet dignity speaks louder than pride ever could. The house felt strangely empty that evening. After Vanessa left for the gala, Daniel tried making small talk, but he kept checking his phone for updates from her. I told him not to worry. The night would go fine. He smiled, though I could tell his thoughts were elsewhere. I washed my cup quietly and went to bed early. As I lay down, I thought about how different things used to be, when people cared more about craftsmanship than cameras. Somewhere deep down, I missed that kind of pride, the kind that didn't need applause. Later that night, I scrolled through photos from the gala online. The cameras flashed, and Vanessa was right in the middle of every shot, her repaired gown glowing under the lights. People complimented her dress, calling it flawless. I recognized my own stitching on the waistline, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. It made me smile, not from ego, but from the quiet reminder that skill doesn't fade, it waits. I closed the screen and whispered to myself that time always has a way of setting things straight. The next morning, Vanessa was cheerful. She said the night went perfectly and that everyone loved her dress. I congratulated her and asked if she enjoyed herself. She said it was a night to remember. Daniel mentioned that one of the designers at the event wanted to see her again for a collaboration. Vanessa glowed with excitement. I only nodded, letting her have her moment. I didn't need to be known anymore. It was enough to see her proud, even if she didn't understand the full story behind her success. After breakfast, Vanessa invited some of her friends over. They talked about the gala and shared photos, laughing and sipping coffee from fragile cups. I sat nearby, quietly reading a magazine. One of the guests mentioned how beautiful Vanessa's gown looked after the emergency repair. Vanessa brushed it off, saying her designer handled it perfectly. I didn't react. Let her have her story. Truth doesn't always need a stage. Sometimes it's best left sitting in the quiet corners of a room, sipping tea and smiling at the noise of youth. When her friends left, Vanessa finally seemed relaxed. She started tidying up and hummed softly, feeling accomplished. Daniel went to work, and the house felt peaceful again. I walked through the living room, admiring the framed photos of their travels. They looked happy, like a life well put together. I wondered if that kind of happiness came from love or from trying to prove something to the world. Either way, I hoped they'd never find out what it feels like when applause fades and only silence remains. That afternoon, I found an old box of buttons and threads in my suitcase. I took them out and began sewing a simple scarf while the rain fell outside. The rhythm of the needle brought me comfort, the same calm I used to feel in my workshop. When Vanessa came into the room, she looked surprised to see me working. She asked what I was making, and I told her it was just a small gift for her. She thanked me politely, though her expression said she didn't quite understand why anyone would bother making things by hand. The next day, Daniel asked if I could stay a few more days. Vanessa hesitated but smiled when she saw him looking at her. I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to see if the distance between us could close a little. That evening, I helped set the table for dinner. Vanessa cooked, and for once, she seemed calmer. I complimented her meal, and she looked genuinely pleased. It was a small thing, but I noticed her face soften. Sometimes, kindness works where pride never could. After dinner, I sat alone in the living room. I noticed a small framed certificate on the shelf. It was Vanessa's fashion degree. I studied it for a moment, thinking of how far the industry had come and how much it had lost. The art of sewing by hand, the patience for details. Those were fading away. I wondered what Vanessa might learn if she spent just one day behind a sewing machine, stitching something not for fame, but for love of the craft. Maybe someday she'd understand. The next morning, Vanessa had a phone call with one of her designer friends. I overheard the conversation while preparing tea. They were planning a charity fashion show and needed help with last-minute outfit adjustments. Vanessa volunteered eagerly, bragging about her great eye for detail. I smiled to myself. It's easy to speak confidently when you've never faced the pressure of true craftsmanship. She ended the call and turned to me, asking if I'd like to come watch. I said yes, not to interfere, but to see what kind of woman she was becoming. When we arrived at the venue, I recognized the designer's name immediately. It was someone I once trained many years ago. Back when I still worked under my label, I didn't mention it. The place was buzzing with people, models, stylists, and assistants, rushing everywhere. Vanessa fit right in, wearing her confidence like perfume. I sat quietly in the back, watching her direct others with authority. She had the right drive, I thought, but not yet the humility that gives art its soul. I wondered if life would ever teach her that lesson. While Vanessa checked fittings, I noticed one of the models struggling with a loose zipper. I walked over and fixed it in seconds, using a simple technique no one else seemed to know. The young model thanked me, surprised at how quickly it was done. A few people watched, whispering among themselves. Vanessa looked up, slightly annoyed that attention shifted my way. I smiled and went back to my seat. I didn't mean to steal her moment. I just couldn't stand by while something so small went wrong. Old habits don't fade easily. Later, Vanessa joined me backstage, holding a clipboard. She seemed tense. I asked if everything was all right, and she muttered something about how stressful events like these could be. I nodded, telling her that stress usually comes when we forget why we started. She looked puzzled, but didn't respond. I could tell her mind was spinning somewhere between pride and pressure. I didn't blame her. I had been there once, chasing perfection until I realized perfection was just another name for emptiness. That evening, after the show ended, Vanessa was frustrated. One of the dresses didn't fit properly, and the designer was unhappy. I offered to look at it, and though she hesitated, she finally handed it over. I examined it, fixed a few seams, and smoothed out the hem. When I handed it back, it looked flawless. The designer looked at me curiously and asked where I learned to sew like that. I only smiled and said, "It's been a lifetime." Vanessa said nothing but looked at me with new eyes. Back home that night, I sat by the window again, the sound of rain filling the silence. I thought about how small gestures can shift people's hearts, even if they never say it out loud. Daniel came in to check on me, thanking me for helping at the show. I told him I was just doing what I've always done, fixing what's broken quietly. He smiled and said Vanessa talked about me all the way home. That surprised me. Maybe the thread of understanding was finally beginning to form. The next morning, I found Vanessa in the kitchen. She was scrolling through her phone, looking serious. She told me the designer had posted a photo of the fixed dress online, crediting a mysterious helping hand for saving the night. I laughed softly and told her mystery makes everything prettier. She asked directly if it was me. I didn't answer. I only said that talent is never really gone. It just chooses when to show itself again. She stared at me, maybe realizing there was more to my silence than she'd ever guessed. Later, Vanessa decided to clean out one of the storage rooms. She asked if I wanted to help, and I agreed. As we sorted boxes, she came across an old sewing machine I had given Daniel years ago, still covered in dust. She asked if I wanted to throw it out. I paused and said no, that some things hold stories even when they stop working. She shrugged and placed it aside. When she wasn't looking, I brushed the dust from its surface and whispered a quiet promise to bring it back to life someday. That afternoon, Daniel was out, and Vanessa was busy on another call. I used the quiet time to mend a small tear in the curtain. As I stitched, the rhythm of the thread brought back memories, the smell of fresh fabric, the sound of scissors on cloth, the soft hum of creation. I thought about how something as simple as fixing a tear could feel like healing a wound. When Vanessa walked by, she stopped and watched silently. She didn't say a word, but for the first time, there was no judgment in her eyes. In the evening, Daniel returned with a gift, a framed photo of me from my younger days, standing in front of my old boutique. I hadn't seen that photo in years. I held it carefully, tracing the edges. Vanessa looked at it and asked where it was taken. I told her it was from the time I worked for a fashion house called Rowan Atelier. She tilted her head, saying she'd heard of that name. I smiled faintly and said it was a long time ago. Some stories take years before people realize they were real. The next morning, Vanessa had guests again, this time from her design circle. They talked about upcoming fashion trends and sustainable materials. I stayed quiet in the kitchen, listening while making tea. One of them mentioned a vintage label that inspired many modern designers, Rowan Atelier. My hands paused mid-stir. Vanessa's friend spoke about the mysterious seamstress behind it, known only as M. Rowan. I glanced toward the living room, curious if Vanessa was paying attention. She wasn't yet. I smiled quietly, knowing time would reveal the truth in its own way. After the guests left, Vanessa mentioned how fascinating that story was. She said she loved the mystery behind old brands and wondered what happened to people like that. I told her that sometimes legends just choose peace over fame. She said she'd never do that. She wanted her name remembered. I only nodded. I once thought the same thing. But I learned that being remembered means little if you lose yourself in the process. She didn't understand. Not yet, but she would. Life always has a way of teaching what pride refuses to learn. Later that evening, Daniel suggested watching old home videos. He played clips from when he was a child, running around the house while I worked on dresses in the background. Vanessa watched closely, noticing how steady my hands were, how confident each movement looked. She commented softly that I seemed professional. Daniel smiled and said I'd always been that way. I didn't correct him. He didn't know the half of it. Vanessa's eyes lingered on the screen, thoughtful and quiet. For the first time, she seemed more curious than dismissive. That night, as I went to my room, I found Vanessa standing in the hallway, holding one of my scarves. She asked how long it took me to make it. I said a few days, depending on the fabric. She nodded and said it looked expensive. I laughed and told her that art doesn't have a price. It has purpose. She looked at me for a moment like she wanted to ask more, but instead she just said goodnight. Small cracks were forming in her pride, and through them, understanding was beginning to shine. The following day, I decided to visit a small thrift shop nearby. Vanessa offered to drive me, though she didn't understand why I'd want to go there. I told her sometimes the past hides in places people overlook. Inside the shop, I found a coat almost identical to one I'd made years ago. I touched the fabric gently and smiled. The owner recognized me instantly and thanked me for my work years ago. Vanessa's eyes widened in confusion. I could tell she wanted to ask questions, but the truth was still too close for her to see. Back at home, she couldn't stop thinking about that moment. I saw her searching online that evening, typing Rowan Atelier into her phone. She scrolled for a long time, reading articles and looking at old photos. She found a picture of a runway model wearing a coat, just like mine. Her eyes darted between the screen and the coat, hanging near the door. I watched from the hallway, unseen. I could almost feel the moment her mind began to piece it all together. Realization always starts with a whisper, not a shout. Later that night, she came into the living room, quiet and thoughtful. She sat across from me and asked if I ever worked in fashion before. I looked up from my book and said softly that I did, a long time ago. Her face froze, caught between disbelief and guilt. I didn't elaborate. Some truths are better discovered than explained. She excused herself, but I could tell her thoughts were racing. For the first time since I arrived, she saw me not as an old woman, but as someone she didn't fully understand yet. The next morning, Vanessa seemed distant. She barely touched her breakfast and kept glancing at me as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Daniel noticed her silence and asked if something was wrong. She quickly said everything was fine, forcing a smile. I pretended not to notice, focusing on my tea instead. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was revealing. Sometimes silence holds more truth than any confession ever could. I could tell she was trying to fit new pieces of me into her old picture of who I was. Later that day, Vanessa suggested we go through some of my old things, claiming she wanted to help organize. I agreed, curious to see where this was going. She followed me to the guest room and watched as I opened my suitcase. Inside were folded clothes, carefully kept sketches, and old photos from my workshop. Her eyes caught on a black and white photo of a model wearing one of my gowns. She asked who took it. Her tone, careful. I said a magazine once did, long ago. She stayed quiet, but I could almost hear her thoughts spinning. That night, after dinner, Daniel received a work call and left the room. Vanessa and I sat in silence for a few moments before she asked how I learned to sew so well. I told her it came from years of practice, long before she was born. She asked if I ever worked for a real label, her voice trembling slightly. I smiled softly and said I used to design for one that no longer exists. She didn't ask for the name this time. Maybe she already knew and was afraid to say it out loud. Later, as I got ready for bed, I found Vanessa standing by the hallway mirror, holding her phone. I caught a glimpse of what she was looking at. Old articles about Rowan Atelier, showing pictures of my designs. Her hands shook slightly as she scrolled. I didn't interrupt. I quietly passed behind her and wished her good night. She nodded without turning around, lost in the glow of the screen. I could see it now, the slow shift of pride turning into realization. The world had changed overnight, but she was only just catching up. The next morning, Vanessa greeted me differently. Her tone was softer, her words slower, almost cautious. She asked if I wanted coffee and waited for my answer instead of assuming. I thanked her and sat down. She mentioned the brand Rowan Atelier again, pretending it was just a casual topic. I nodded and said it was a name that used to mean something. She looked down at her cup, not daring to ask the obvious. I knew she wanted confirmation, but I wasn't ready to give it. Some truths are better earned than offered. Daniel noticed the change in her attitude too. He said she'd been quieter lately, more thoughtful. I told him she was probably just tired, though I knew it was something deeper. Guilt can make people quiet, but reflection can make them kind. The difference is what they choose to do next. That evening, she offered to cook dinner herself instead of ordering takeout. It wasn't perfect, but I praised her effort. She smiled a little, Maybe realizing that respect doesn't need to be asked for, it's given where it's deserved. Later that night, I sat on the porch, watching the rain fall again. Vanessa joined me quietly, wrapped in a blanket. She said she'd been thinking a lot about her career and how fast everything moves. I listened without interrupting. She said sometimes it feels like everyone's chasing attention instead of meaning. I smiled faintly and told her that speed often makes people forget the hands that built the road. She looked at me, and I could tell she understood what I meant. For the first time, her voice didn't carry pride, only honesty. The next morning, I found her in the study, looking through fashion magazines. She showed me a design that reminded her of my old coat. I told her styles come and go, but real artistry never disappears. It just changes faces. She nodded thoughtfully. Then she asked if I ever missed it. The fame, the recognition. I said I missed the feeling of creation, not the applause. She looked at me like she was seeing something she'd never seen before. Respect doesn't arrive with noise. It comes quietly, like morning light slipping through curtains. That evening, Daniel left for a business trip, leaving the two of us alone for a few days. Vanessa seemed nervous at first, unsure how to act without him there. I tried to make her comfortable, asking if she wanted to watch a movie or cook together. She chose to help me make dinner. We talked about small things, food, places she'd visited, the people she worked with. There were no sharp remarks this time, no hidden tone. For once, we were just two women at a table, sharing warmth instead of distance. The next morning was quiet. Rain tapped against the windows, steady and soft. I made tea and sat near the window with a small jar of imported honey Daniel had once brought from abroad. As I stirred it into my cup, I thought about how sweetness works best in small amounts, just enough to change the taste, not overwhelm it. Vanessa joined me, silent for a while, watching the rain. She finally said that my patience surprised her. I told her patience isn't something you're born with. It's something life forces you to learn. She nodded slowly. Later, Vanessa mentioned that one of her friends invited her to a small exhibition of vintage fashion. She asked if I wanted to come. I agreed. At the gallery, the walls were lined with old photographs and garments preserved behind glass. My heart tightened as I recognized some of my work on display, designs from decades ago, labeled only with Mitrowan. Vanessa stood beside me, staring at them silently. She whispered that they were beautiful. I said they belonged to another time. She didn't argue. Some truths don't need to be said aloud to be felt. When we got home, she seemed shaken but inspired. She started sketching new ideas late into the night. I watched her work, noticing how she slowed down, paying attention to the smallest details this time. I smiled, remembering what it felt like to fall in love with creation again. She looked up at me once and asked if she was doing it right. I told her there's no single way to make something right, only ways to make it honest. She thought about that for a long while, her pen hovering over the page. The next morning, she showed me her sketches. They were better, more thoughtful, more grounded. I could see her hand beginning to develop its own personality, not just copying others. She asked if I would give feedback, and I did. Gently, honestly. She listened without interrupting, without defending herself. That was new. I told her the lines were strong but needed feeling. Design should make people remember, not just admire. She thanked me softly. There was no pride in her voice anymore, only curiosity. That was when I knew the change had begun. Daniel called that evening to check in. Vanessa told him everything was fine and that we'd been working on creative stuff. He laughed, surprised. She looked at me after the call and said she hadn't realized how much work went into the kind of art I used to make. I told her every piece was a story stitched into fabric. She said she wanted to create things that told stories too. I smiled and told her she already could. She just needed to stop designing for approval and start designing for truth. That night, she came into my room, holding her tablet. She showed me photos of modern fashion, inspired by older eras, asking if I thought those designers respected the past. I said some did, but many just borrowed without understanding. She frowned and said she wanted to do better. I told her that humility is the bridge between imitation and innovation. She didn't fully grasp it, but I saw the spark in her eyes. Growth doesn't happen overnight. It starts as a quiet wish to be better than who you were yesterday. The next day, Vanessa received an invitation to a major fashion event. She looked nervous, unsure if she wanted to go. I asked why, and she said she didn't feel like she belonged anymore. I told her belonging has nothing to do with where you stand, but with what you stand for. That seemed to calm her. She smiled faintly and said maybe I should come with her. I agreed, mostly to support her, but part of me was curious to see how much she had really changed. At the event, the atmosphere was loud and glittering, full of people dressed to impress. Vanessa introduced me to a few acquaintances, this time calling me her mother-in-law, with pride instead of embarrassment. That small gesture meant more than any compliment I could have received. I saw her confidence returning, but it was different now, softer, steadier. When a designer complimented her gown, she didn't brag or exaggerate. She just said she was still learning. That honesty shone brighter than all the jewels in the room. I knew then that she was finally growing. When we got home that night, I noticed Vanessa stayed unusually quiet. She made tea for both of us and sat down beside me. After a long silence, she said she had spent her whole life chasing attention, thinking it was the same as success. She said seeing me work in silence had changed her. I didn't say anything for a while, then told her that peace is louder than applause if you learn to listen. She smiled weakly and said she wanted to live more like that. I believed her. The following morning, I woke up early to the smell of breakfast. Vanessa was already in the kitchen, humming softly while cooking. She looked peaceful, a version of her I hadn't seen before. She told me she wanted to spend the day learning from me, how to sew properly, how to measure fabric, how to see mistakes before they happen. I agreed, and we spent hours working together. Her hands were clumsy at first, but determined. I saw a piece of myself in her, young, proud, and searching for purpose. It felt like coming full circle. Later that afternoon, while sorting through old fabrics, she found a folded newspaper clipping in one of my boxes. It was an article about the final show I ever designed before retiring. My picture was there, younger and smiling beside a famous model. She held it gently, staring at it for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She asked why I never told anyone about it. I said because some chapters are meant to stay closed until someone's ready to read them. She nodded, unable to speak. That evening, Daniel returned home. He noticed the new calm between us and looked relieved. Vanessa showed him her new sketches and proudly said I'd been helping her. He smiled and said it was about time she learned from the best. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from peace, not pride. I stood back, watching them. For years I had worried that distance would always exist between us. But sometimes, understanding doesn't come from words. It grows quietly between moments, like light seeping through a half-open door. The next day, Vanessa's designer friend dropped by to return something she borrowed. While chatting, the friend noticed my coat hanging on the rack. Her eyes widened instantly. She asked where Vanessa had found it, saying it was one of the original Rowan Atelier pieces from decades ago. Vanessa froze and said it belonged to me. The friend looked stunned, realizing what that meant. She called me a legend, but I just smiled and said, legends are only people who work too long to be forgotten. Vanessa said nothing, but her face told the story. After her friend left, Vanessa sat beside me on the couch, quiet and still. I could see the tears she was holding back. She finally said she didn't know how to make up for how she treated me. I told her she didn't need to make up for it. She just needed to understand why she did it. She admitted she was ashamed of where she came from, always trying to look better than she felt. I told her, there's no shame in being human. Growth starts the moment you stop pretending to be perfect. That night, she stayed up late again, sewing. I walked past her room and saw her working slowly, carefully, as if each stitch carried meaning. She didn't notice me watching. I felt proud, not because she was sewing well, but because she was finally respecting the process. The sound of her needle filled the room with quiet rhythm, like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. For the first time, I felt like maybe she wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Maybe she was simply learning to love creation again. The next morning, she brought me the dress she'd been working on. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its own way. She asked for my opinion, nervously. I told her it reminded me of her. A work in progress with promise and heart. She smiled through tears. I said she had something rare now, something no designer can buy, humility. She hugged me, and in that moment, I realized the distance between us had finally disappeared. Respect had taken its place, stitched quietly through time and patience. The next morning, Vanessa woke up early and made breakfast for everyone. She looked different, somehow calmer, lighter. Daniel noticed and joked that she must have found enlightenment overnight. She laughed and said she just slept well, but I could see it in her eyes. Something had shifted. Over coffee, she asked if I'd show her more of my old sketches. I agreed and brought out a small folder I'd kept hidden for years. As she flipped through each drawing, her expression softened, like she was meeting a part of me she never knew existed. She stopped at one particular sketch, a gown with intricate stitching along the shoulders. I told her it was designed for a royal client decades ago. She looked at it closely and said it was timeless. I smiled, telling her true design never follows trends. It creates them. She nodded, running her fingers gently across the lines. I could see admiration in her eyes, but also something else, regret. I didn't mention it. Sometimes guilt turns into growth on its own, if you let it breathe long enough to change shape. Later that afternoon, she sat in the living room with her laptop, reading articles about my old work. I heard her gasp quietly as she found pictures of my runway shows. She whispered my name aloud, as if testing how it felt. When she looked up and saw me watching from the doorway, her eyes filled with tears. I said nothing. She closed the laptop and stood there for a moment before walking over and hugging me without a word. It wasn't an apology, it was something deeper, like finally seeing a person instead of a shadow. That night, Daniel found Vanessa sitting by the sewing table, still awake. She told him everything, how I was the designer behind Rowan Atelier, how much she had misunderstood me, how ashamed she felt for treating me like someone small. He listened quietly, then hugged her, and said he wasn't surprised. He always knew there was more to me than I let on. Vanessa cried softly, saying she didn't deserve my kindness. But kindness isn't something we give because people earn it. It's something we share because we know how much it once saved us. The next day, I pretended not to notice how careful Vanessa was around me. She spoke gently, asked questions with genuine interest, and even complimented my old coat. I smiled and told her I'd made it in a small studio above a bakery, where the smell of bread mixed with the scent of fabric glue. She laughed, saying that sounded oddly comforting. I told her beauty often comes from imperfect places. She nodded, quietly absorbing every word. For the first time, she didn't try to impress me. She just listened. A few days later, I woke up to find Vanessa cleaning my sewing machine. She said she wanted to fix it up and use it for practice. I helped her oil the gears, guiding her hands like I once did for my apprentices years ago. She smiled every time the needle moved smoothly, like she'd discovered a new language. I told her that sewing teaches patience. It rewards those who don't rush. She nodded thoughtfully and said she finally understood why I loved it so much. That small machine connected us more than words ever could. One evening, while Daniel was out, Vanessa made us dinner and insisted I sit while she served. She seemed nervous, like she was working up to something. After we ate, she confessed that she had gone through some of my old sketchbooks without asking. I smiled and said I already knew. She apologized sincerely, saying she just couldn't believe what she'd found. I told her curiosity isn't a sin if it comes with respect. Her shoulders relaxed, and she thanked me for being patient with her. Sometimes, grace is the only answer people truly remember. Later that night, Vanessa walked into my room, holding one of my oldest dresses. She asked if I'd made it entirely by hand. I said yes, back when we couldn't afford machines. She looked amazed and said she couldn't imagine how long it took. I told her time was never the issue. Care was. She said softly that she never cared about anything the way I did about my work. I told her it's never too late to start. She smiled through tears, saying she hoped one day she could make something that meant as much. The next morning, Vanessa left early to visit a local tailor she'd found online. She said she wanted to learn more about techniques and fabric types. When she came back, Her hands were full of materials: cotton, silk, lace, each chosen carefully. She spread them across the table and asked for my advice. I helped her identify each one, explaining texture, stretch, and breathability. She listened intently, writing notes like a student. Watching her made me proud. Sometimes, life doesn't give you a daughter by blood, but it sends you one by understanding. That evening, Daniel surprised us both with a dinner reservation at a small restaurant nearby. As we ate, Vanessa reached across the table and said she wanted to do something special for my upcoming birthday. I told her she didn't need to. She insisted, saying it wasn't about obligation, it was gratitude. Daniel smiled, clearly happy to see the two of us getting along. For the first time in a long while, the table felt like family again, not a place of quiet judgment. It felt like home, simple and warm. The following week, Vanessa became busier than usual. She kept her plans secret, telling me only that she was working on something. I didn't press her. I recognized the look in her eyes, the mix of nerves and excitement that comes with creation. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed distracted, sneaking glances at his phone and whispering about the surprise. I smiled to myself, pretending not to notice. Sometimes, life gives you gifts you don't unwrap with your hands, but with your heart. I had a feeling this one would be something I'd never forget. On the morning of my birthday, the house was quiet. Vanessa and Daniel told me to dress nicely, but they wouldn't say why. When we arrived at the city center, I saw a small crowd gathered outside an art gallery. My name was printed on the banner above the door, "The Forgotten Hands Behind Elegance." My heart stopped for a moment. Inside, the walls were lined with my old designs, sketches, and photos from decades ago. I turned to Vanessa, who smiled through tears. She whispered that the world deserved to see what I once gave it. I walked through the gallery slowly, touching the glass that covered my work. Each piece carried memories: the long nights, the laughter, the exhaustion, the pride. I saw people admiring the details, taking photos, whispering about the craftsmanship. Vanessa stood beside me, introducing me quietly as her mother-in-law. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the quiet guest in someone else's home. I was seen, not for fame or recognition, but for the legacy I had unknowingly left behind. My heart felt both heavy and light at the same time. After the exhibit, reporters asked questions about my career. I answered gently, avoiding anything dramatic. One of them asked why I stopped designing. I said life called me to other things. They nodded respectfully. Vanessa stood proudly beside me, holding my arm like she was guarding something precious. Daniel looked at us both, clearly moved. I didn't crave attention anymore, but seeing their pride gave me something even better, a feeling of completion. Sometimes, we don't need to chase our name being remembered. It finds its way back to us when the time is right. That night, when we returned home, I sat by the window again. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the glass. Vanessa brought me tea without being asked. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The silence between us felt peaceful now, not strained. She finally whispered that she hoped I forgave her for how she treated me before. I told her I already had, long ago. Forgiveness isn't something you give once. It's something you live by. She smiled, and for the first time I saw genuine humility in her eyes. The following week, Vanessa began helping me organize my old designs. She wanted to catalog them properly, so they wouldn't be forgotten again. We spent hours sorting fabrics, photos, and sketches. Daniel helped scan everything onto a computer. I watched them both working side by side, and felt proud of the quiet teamwork growing between them. The past that once divided us was now bringing us closer. Every piece of fabric we touched carried more than art. It carried reconciliation. I realized that legacies don't just live in museums, they live in people too. One afternoon, Vanessa showed me an idea she had for a new collection inspired by my early work. She wanted to call it Grace Restitched. I smiled at the name. It fit perfectly. She said she wanted me to guide her through it, not just as family, but as her mentor. I agreed, touched by her sincerity. We began planning right away, sketching designs that combined her modern flair with my classic simplicity. It felt like passing a torch, not through words, but through thread and trust. It was the beginning of something beautiful. As the days passed, our bond deepened. Vanessa would often ask about my childhood, my early struggles, and the people who shaped my craft. I told her about the small town factory where I first learned to sew, about the long nights spent chasing perfection, and the kindness of those who believed in me when I had nothing. She listened with full attention, sometimes taking notes. I realized she wasn't just learning to design clothes, she was learning the story behind every stitch. And in doing so, she was learning how to value people too. One evening, as we reviewed designs, Vanessa suddenly asked if I regretted leaving the fashion world. I thought for a moment, and said no. I had traded the spotlight for peace, and that was a fair exchange. She said she hoped she could have both someday. I told her maybe she could, if she remembered what truly matters when applause fades. She smiled, and said she would try. Watching her mature reminded me of who I used to be before pride took its toll. Growth looks different on everyone, but it always feels the same, quiet. When Vanessa's new collection was finally ready, she decided to launch it quietly online, instead of through a big event. She said she wanted the clothes to speak for themselves. I helped her photograph each piece, adjusting fabric and lighting like I used to in the old days. The simplicity of it felt right. When the collection went live, the response was overwhelming. People loved the authenticity and elegance. Vanessa looked at me in disbelief, her eyes shining. I told her it wasn't luck, it was honesty, and people can always feel that. In the following days, messages poured in from designers and journalists, asking about her inspiration. She told them the truth, that her mother-in-law, once a forgotten designer, had taught her everything she knew. They wrote articles about our story, calling it a bridge between generations. I didn't care for the attention, but I was proud of her courage to give credit where it was due. She'd learned that humility doesn't make you smaller, it makes your voice last longer. For the first time, I saw her shining for the right reasons. Daniel was happier than I'd seen him in years. He said watching us work together was the best gift he could have asked for. The house felt different now, warmer, alive. Vanessa had started teaching me how to use a few digital tools too, laughing at how confused I looked at the screen. It was a small exchange, my old world for her new one. That's how families evolve, I thought. Not through grand gestures, but through shared moments that blend the past and present into something that feels like home. A few weeks later, Vanessa received an invitation to speak at a young designer's seminar. She asked if I'd come along. On stage, she talked about the importance of respecting tradition and honoring those who came before. She introduced me to the crowd, saying I was her greatest teacher. The audience applauded warmly. I didn't need the recognition, but watching her speak with such honesty filled me with quiet pride. It wasn't just her success anymore. It was our story, stitched together from mistakes, forgiveness, and love. After the event, a young designer approached me, asking for advice. He said he struggled to find his own style. I told him to stop searching for style and start searching for truth. He thanked me and left smiling. Vanessa heard me say it, and later admitted that she'd been trying to find her truth for years. I told her she had already found it. It was in every act of kindness she now showed. Style fades, but character remains. That's what gives beauty its soul. She nodded, understanding more than ever before. That evening, back at home, we celebrated with a quiet dinner. Vanessa raised a toast, thanking me for showing her what real success looks like. I told her she didn't need to thank me, because everything she learned was already inside her. It just needed time to grow. Daniel smiled, proud of both of us. The house felt peaceful, filled with laughter and light. I realized then that forgiveness had finished its work. What began with ridicule had ended with respect, and the thread between us had finally mended completely. The following week, Vanessa came to me with a new idea. She wanted to start a small workshop to teach others the art of sewing by hand. She said too many people had forgotten the beauty of patience in creation. I agreed to help, and we began planning it together. Daniel offered to handle the logistics, smiling proudly as we brainstormed. The idea wasn't about money or recognition. It was about keeping something precious alive. For the first time in years, I felt the same excitement I once had when I first began designing. We spent days preparing the space, turning Daniel's unused study into a small sewing room. We filled it with fabric rolls, spools of thread, and a few old machines I'd kept in storage. Vanessa painted a small sign for the door that read Grace Restitched. The name made me smile every time I looked at it. On the first day, only 3 students showed up. Vanessa looked nervous, but I told her great things always start small. She took a deep breath and began teaching, her confidence quiet but strong. Watching her instruct the students reminded me of my younger self. She explained each step carefully, her tone patient and kind. When one of the students grew frustrated with a crooked seam, she comforted them gently, saying even mistakes can lead to something beautiful. I saw her growth in every word. When the class ended, she thanked me for being there. I told her she didn't need my presence anymore. She was doing just fine on her own. She smiled, but I could see she still valued the comfort of knowing I was near. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner to celebrate the workshop's success. We laughed together, remembering how awkward things once were between us all. Vanessa said she felt like she'd finally found her purpose. I told her purpose isn't something you find. It's something that finds you once you stop pretending. She nodded, taking those words to heart. The night ended quietly, but it carried warmth. For the first time, the house didn't feel divided. It felt whole. I looked around and realized I didn't just mend clothes anymore. I'd helped mend a family. The next day, Vanessa showed me a letter from a local gallery. They wanted to feature her new collection and include a segment about our shared story. She asked if I would attend the event with her. I hesitated at first, but she said it wouldn't feel right without me. I agreed, not for attention, but for her. She had worked hard to earn this moment. The event would be a new chapter, not just for her, but for the lessons that brought her here. Pride can fade, but grace always finds a way to return. At the event, the gallery was filled with familiar faces from the fashion world. Some of them recognized me, their surprise hidden behind polite smiles. Vanessa stood confidently, talking about her designs and crediting me as her greatest influence. The crowd listened closely. I could tell they respected her sincerity more than her style. One reporter asked if we planned to collaborate again. Vanessa said we already had. Our collaboration wasn't just on fabric, but on forgiveness. The audience applauded softly, and I felt something rare, peace without pride. It was enough. Later that night, when we returned home, Vanessa handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver pendant shaped like a spool of thread. She said it symbolized everything I'd taught her: patience, love, and the power of creation. I held it tightly, unable to speak for a moment. She said she hoped to carry my legacy forward, not through fame, but through kindness. I told her she already had. The world remembers art, but it cherishes those who make others feel seen. She hugged me, and for once, I let my tears fall freely. The next morning, I woke up early and found Vanessa already sketching at the kitchen table. She said she couldn't sleep. Her mind was full of new ideas. I watched her draw quietly, realizing she no longer looked for approval. Her lines had confidence now, but not arrogance. I told her she was becoming the kind of designer people remember, not because of her name, but because of her heart. She smiled and said she learned from the best. I laughed softly, knowing that the best teachers are simply those who refuse to give up on love. Weeks passed, and the workshop grew in popularity. More students joined, eager to learn the art that machines had replaced. Vanessa managed the classes while I supervised from the corner, offering small corrections when needed. The room buzzed with laughter and focus. Watching those young hands learn the same techniques I once mastered filled me with quiet joy. One student told Vanessa she inspired them to follow their dreams. She looked at me afterward and whispered that she finally understood what real success felt like. It wasn't applause, it was impact. One afternoon, Vanessa called me into the workshop to see something special. She had redesigned one of my old gowns into a modern piece. The result was stunning. A perfect balance between tradition and innovation. She said it was her way of saying thank you. I ran my hand over the fabric, feeling the blend of both our worlds. I told her she didn't just make a dress, she made a bridge. She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. For me, that moment said everything words couldn't. The past and present had finally shaken hands. A few days later, Daniel surprised us with news that the story of our workshop had been featured in a local magazine. The article called it A Legacy of Hands and Heart. They praised Vanessa for reviving traditional artistry and honored my early contributions. I didn't crave recognition anymore, but it was nice to know the craft lived on through her. Vanessa framed the article and hung it in the sewing room. Every time I saw it, I didn't see fame or success. I saw forgiveness stitched into paper and ink. That evening, we had dinner together on the porch. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Vanessa thanked me again for everything. I told her that gratitude is shown, not spoken, and she'd already shown it in every way that mattered. Daniel poured tea for us and said he never thought life would turn out this peaceful. I smiled and said peace isn't found, it's built, thread by thread, one choice at a time. We all sat quietly, watching the horizon as day gave way to calm, comforting night. The next morning, Vanessa received an invitation from a design school asking her to give a guest lecture about craftsmanship. She asked if I'd join her on stage. I agreed, though I preferred to sit quietly in the background. During her lecture, she spoke passionately about respecting the past and learning from those who came before. She told the students that elegance wasn't about money or fame, it was about care. When she introduced me, the audience applauded warmly. I stood for a moment, humbled, then sat down again with a smile. After the lecture, a young woman approached us with tears in her eyes. She said she had almost given up on design until she heard Vanessa speak. She thanked us both for reminding her why she started. Vanessa hugged her, moved by the moment. As we left the hall, I told Vanessa that's what legacy truly is, lighting someone else's path after you've found your own. She said she wanted to do that for the rest of her life. I nodded, proud, knowing she finally understood what I had been trying to teach all along. That night, I sat alone in my room, holding the pendant Vanessa had given me. I thought about how far we had come, from mockery to mutual respect. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock. I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not for recognition, but for the chance to see Grace return home. Some stories don't end in grand finales. They end in small, perfect moments of peace, where every wound finally feels healed. If you've ever been underestimated for what you once were, stay with me. What happens next will make every quiet moment worth it. The next morning, Vanessa brought me a fresh cup of coffee and said she wanted to show me something. She led me to the backyard, where Daniel had helped her set up a small wooden sign. It read, Rowan Atelier, the next chapter. Beneath it were my initials, carved gently into the wood. I stood there in silence, tears blurring my vision. She said she wanted the name to live on, not as a brand, but as a promise. I hugged her tightly, grateful for the life that had come full circle. We spent the rest of the day cleaning the new space they'd built behind the house. It was small but full of light, with wide tables, spools of thread, and shelves lined with fabrics of every color. Vanessa said she wanted to keep it as a workshop for future students. Daniel offered to handle the business side, so we could focus on the creative part. I looked around and felt a sense of belonging stronger than I'd ever known. My hands had once built careers for others. Now they were building memories for family. As the weeks went on, Vanessa began teaching evening classes for young women who couldn't afford fashion school. She told them skill mattered more than status. I helped where I could, guiding them with patience. The students respected her deeply, not because of her name, but because of how she carried herself. One evening, after class, she said she never imagined finding happiness in something so simple. I told her simplicity often holds the richest joy. She smiled, saying that's something her old self would never have understood. Growth, it seemed, had found her fully. One morning, we received a package from a well-known designer. Inside was a handwritten note, praising Vanessa's work and offering a partnership. She read it out loud, her hands shaking. I could see the excitement in her eyes, but also hesitation. She asked if I thought she should accept. I told her to choose what keeps her heart steady, not what fills her pockets. She took a deep breath and said she wanted to stay true to her path. I felt proud beyond words. Sometimes strength means saying no to everything that glitters. A few days later, Vanessa announced she wanted to create a limited collection in my honor. She said it would be called The Seamstress's Legacy. I laughed softly, saying the name sounded too grand, but she insisted. She wanted it to be a tribute, not to fame, but to quiet perseverance. As she worked on the designs, I watched her blend my old techniques with her modern touch. The result was breathtaking. For the first time, I saw myself reflected in someone else's work, and it felt like the past had been rewritten with kindness. When the collection launched online, it sold out within hours. Vanessa was overwhelmed by the response. Journalists wrote about the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law duo who redefined timeless fashion. She showed me the comments, full of admiration and love. I told her success is sweetest when shared. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said none of it would have happened without me. I said maybe not, but without her, my story would have stayed unfinished. Sometimes, it takes a new generation to give an old story its ending. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner to celebrate again. As we ate, Vanessa handed me a letter. It was from a local university offering me an honorary award for lifetime contribution to fashion. I was stunned. I hadn't expected that kind of recognition after all these years. Vanessa said she had secretly nominated me months ago. I laughed and told her she'd finally outsmarted me. She grinned, saying it was payback for all the lessons I taught her. We all laughed together, the sound filling the room with warmth and gratitude. On the day of the award ceremony, I wore my old coat, the same one that started everything. As I stepped on stage, the audience applauded. I gave a short speech, thanking not the industry, but the people who believed in me when I stopped believing in myself. I ended by saying the most beautiful designs are not made of fabric, but of forgiveness. The crowd stood and clapped. I saw Vanessa wiping her tears, proud and full of love. It wasn't just my award, it was ours. We had stitched our lives back together perfectly. After the ceremony, Vanessa came to me holding the award. She said it belonged in our workshop, not on a shelf. Together we placed it by the window, where sunlight touched it every morning. It reminded us of what truly mattered, not recognition, but redemption. I told her that every time she looked at it, she should remember how far we had come. She nodded, promising she would. The award gleamed softly in the light, a quiet symbol of everything words could never capture. Our story had finally found its peace. That night, as the house grew quiet, I sat by the window one last time, watching the rain. The sound felt like an old friend returning. I thought about the years I spent sewing alone, never knowing the future would bring this kind of closure. Vanessa walked in with 2 cups of tea. We sat together in silence, watching the raindrops race down the glass. She said softly that she loved me. I smiled and said love, like thread, only grows stronger when stretched. Outside, the night felt calm, whole, and beautifully complete. In the days after the ceremony, messages poured in from all over. Old colleagues, long-lost students, and even strangers sent letters saying how my story inspired them. I read each one slowly, amazed at how life had come full circle. Vanessa smiled every time she saw my name mentioned online, proud in a way that felt genuine. But what mattered most wasn't the attention. It was the quiet understanding that everything I once thought was lost had simply been waiting to be found again. Sometimes, time doesn't erase what's important. It preserves it until we're ready. The workshop grew busier, filled with laughter, mistakes, and lessons. Vanessa handled most of it now, confident and calm. I often sat in the corner, watching the students learn. Every so often, one of them would come to me for help, and I'd guide their hands just like I did for Vanessa. The sound of sewing machines blended with soft conversation, creating a rhythm that felt alive. I realized I didn't miss my old life anymore. I was living it again, just in a quieter, more meaningful form that no runway could ever replace. One afternoon, Vanessa brought home an old magazine she'd found at a thrift store. My face was on the cover, young, smiling, and holding one of my first designs. She placed it on my lap and said it felt like fate. I laughed softly, remembering the long nights behind that picture. She said she wanted to frame it for the workshop, but I told her to keep it for herself. The past belonged to both of us now, one who lived it, and one who learned from it. It was no longer history, it was legacy. Daniel suggested taking a trip to my hometown. At first, I wasn't sure. It had been years since I'd walked those old streets, but when we arrived, memories came flooding back. The small bakery near the corner still stood, though run by new hands. The church bell rang in the distance, just as it did when I worked in that tiny studio above the bakery. Vanessa listened carefully as I told stories about my early struggles. She held my arm gently, as if afraid that time might pull me back into those years and not return me. When we reached the spot where my old workshop once stood, I stopped. The building was gone, replaced by a small community center. Vanessa and Daniel walked quietly beside me, sensing the weight of the moment. I closed my eyes, picturing the laughter, the sound of scissors, and the smell of fresh fabric. Then I smiled. Nothing truly disappears when it's built with love. I turned to Vanessa and said everything that mattered from that place had already been passed to her. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, understanding exactly what I meant. Back home, life settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings were for teaching, afternoons for rest, evenings for family dinners. The house felt alive, not because of what filled it, but because of the peace between us. Vanessa sometimes called me Mama, and every time she did, my heart grew warm. We had both changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Forgiveness had stitched us together so tightly that even silence felt like love. I looked at her and thought how strange and beautiful it is that respect can grow from the soil of misunderstanding. One rainy afternoon, Vanessa came to me with another surprise. She had been invited to showcase her collection at an international event, and she wanted me to come along. I hesitated at first, saying the world belonged to her now, but she insisted, saying none of it would exist without me. I agreed, touched by her sincerity. At the show, she presented her collection titled Threads of Grace. The final piece was a recreation of my old coat, modernized but still carrying my original pattern. The audience rose in applause. I felt tears welling instantly. After the show, Vanessa brought me on stage. She introduced me as the woman who taught her that elegance begins with kindness. The crowd cheered, and for a moment I felt like time had folded back on itself. But this wasn't about glory, it was about closure. When I looked at her standing proudly beside me, I saw the reflection of everything I once was, and everything I hoped the world would remember. Not fame, not wealth, just dignity. That moment was more beautiful than any spotlight I had ever stood under. The next day, while packing to return home, I noticed Vanessa carefully folding the coat from the show. She said she wanted to keep it in the workshop as a reminder of where it all began. I told her to do so, but also to wear it sometimes. Clothes, like people, are meant to live, not be trapped behind glass. She smiled and said she'd wear it whenever she needed strength. I knew she meant it. That coat had survived mockery, rediscovery, and love. It carried stories no words could ever fully tell. Back at home, things slowed down again. We reopened the workshop, and new students kept arriving, drawn by the story they'd read online. Vanessa's teaching grew sharper, but still kind. I watched proudly as she guided others through their first mistakes. Sometimes I'd quietly step in to fix a seam or tighten a thread, but mostly, I let her lead. The workshop had become hers now, as it should be. My job wasn't to control the story anymore. It was to let it continue without me, and that, I realized, was true peace. One evening as the sun set, Vanessa brought out an old album she had put together. It was filled with photos of my early work, the gallery event, the workshop, and our family dinners. On the final page she had written, "From laughter to legacy, thank you for teaching me grace." I couldn't hold back tears. I told her life had given me many rewards, but none compared to this. She hugged me tightly, whispering that love like this doesn't happen twice. I told her it didn't need to. It just needed to last. Months passed peacefully. I spent more time resting while Vanessa and Daniel handled most of the day-to-day work. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of students laughing or the hum of sewing machines. It reminded me that creation continues even when the creator steps back. I didn't feel old or forgotten. I felt fulfilled. My days were quiet, but every thread of my life was finally in place. It's strange how everything we lose returns, not the same, but softer, wiser, and perfectly timed. That's how forgiveness works. It changes everything it touches. One morning, Vanessa came running into my room, breathless with excitement. She had received a message from a major fashion museum. They wanted to acquire a few of my original pieces for their permanent collection. I sat in stunned silence. I never imagined my work would live that long after me. Vanessa cried, saying it was the least the world could do. I told her I didn't need immortality in glass cases, but if it meant inspiring others, I was grateful. Some things are worth remembering, not because they're perfect, but because they carry heart. We prepared the dresses carefully, packaging them with love. As Vanessa labeled each one, she paused at the coat, the one that began everything. She asked if I wanted to keep it. I told her it should go with the others, but she shook her head. "This one stays," she said softly. I smiled, knowing she was right. Some things belong to the living, to remind them of what they carry forward. I hung the coat by the door, its stitching still firm. It wasn't just fabric anymore, it was family. Weeks later, the museum held a small ceremony for the collection's arrival. Vanessa spoke on my behalf, describing my journey and how grace can outlast time. I sat quietly in the front row, feeling like a visitor in my own history. When the curtain lifted to reveal my old gowns behind glass, the audience gasped softly. They looked beautiful, frozen in their prime. But I didn't feel sad. They had served their purpose. Their story now belonged to those who would see them and feel something real again. That was enough for me. When we returned home, the town had organized a small celebration in our honor. Neighbors, students, and old friends filled the house with flowers and laughter. Someone played music from my era, and the sound brought me back to my early days. Vanessa looked at me, smiling proudly, and said this was how life was supposed to be, full of second chances. I nodded, knowing she was right. There are few gifts greater than living long enough to see your mistakes turn into miracles. That night, I went to bed feeling completely at peace. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. The house was quiet, but full of warmth. I sat by the window, holding a cup of tea, listening to the faint sound of the sewing machines in the distance. It was the perfect sound, the sound of life continuing. Vanessa peeked in and asked how I felt. I said I felt grateful. She smiled and said the students were waiting for me. I told her I'd join them soon, though part of me just wanted to sit and soak in the peace I'd waited a lifetime for. That afternoon, Vanessa introduced a new project to her students. She called it the Memory Line, inspired by the people and moments that shape us. She explained how every design carries a piece of its creator's story. I watched her speak with passion and grace, realizing she no longer needed my voice beside hers. She had found her own rhythm. I felt a quiet pride, the kind that doesn't seek attention. The best teachers are the ones who make themselves unnecessary. Vanessa had become exactly what I hoped she would, a living legacy. One evening, I found Vanessa sitting alone in the workshop, holding a spool of red thread. She said she liked how something so simple could hold so much power to mend, to connect, to transform. I told her that thread was the perfect symbol of our story. She tied a small piece of it around her wrist and smiled, saying she'd keep it as a reminder. I looked at her and thought how strange it is that the things we once overlooked become the anchors that hold our lives together. The smallest details mean the most. As months turned into years, our workshop became a local landmark. People came from far and wide to learn, not just sewing, but patience and respect for craft. Vanessa's name grew in reputation, but she always credited me in every interview. I often stayed in the background, happy just to watch her shine. Fame never suited me, but seeing her find purpose was enough. Every stitch, every smile, every shared story, it all felt like one long thread, stretching through generations, strong and unbroken. That's how love survives, not loud, but lasting. One day, Vanessa and Daniel took me to a newly opened museum exhibit. To my surprise, it was dedicated entirely to the women who shaped modern fashion. My portrait hung among other great designers. I stood before it, overwhelmed. Vanessa squeezed my hand and said quietly, "You belong here." I smiled and told her that belonging isn't found in walls or names, it's found in people who carry your story forward. She nodded, tears in her eyes. That day, I realized the world hadn't forgotten me. It had simply waited for me to return in her. That evening, we returned home and had dinner by candlelight. The sound of rain began again, outside, gentle and familiar. Vanessa brought out an old record player, and played music from the decade I first designed. We laughed, danced, and remembered everything we'd been through. As the song played, I looked around the table at my family and thought about how love always finds its way back, no matter how lost it seems. I no longer felt like a forgotten designer. I felt like a mother whose work had found its home in hearts. Later that night, as the house quieted down, I walked to the hallway where my coat hung. The fabric felt warm beneath my hand. I smiled, thinking of the journey it had taken. Mocked, forgotten, rediscovered, loved. Vanessa joined me, wrapping her arm around my shoulder. She said it all began with that coat. I nodded, telling her that sometimes the things people laugh at first become the very things they treasure most. She whispered that she'd never forget that lesson. I knew she wouldn't. Lessons learned with humility never fade. As weeks went by, life settled again into calm. I spent most mornings watching Vanessa teach, her students hanging on to every word. Daniel often joined us, helping around the workshop. Every now and then I'd fix a loose stitch or adjust a pattern, but mostly I just watched. I realized that love, once repaired, doesn't need maintenance, it just needs presence. Watching her carry my legacy so gracefully was more rewarding than any award or headline. I had spent a lifetime designing for others, but this was my masterpiece. Years later, as I sat by the same window where it all began, I saw Vanessa walking outside wearing the coat she once mocked. The rain fell softly, glistening against the fabric. She waved at me through the glass, smiling, a reflection of everything that had changed. I smiled back, knowing my work was complete. True style never fades. It simply waits to be seen again. And sometimes when it returns, it doesn't just change the world around you, it heals the hearts that once couldn't see its beauty. That, I thought, is the real art of grace.